They say silence speaks louder than words, but sometimes silence hides the deepest wounds. Rosa Martinez had been invisible for so long that even her own reflection seemed to fade in the ornate mirrors of the Pacific Heights mansion. And what happened on that fog-drenched Tuesday morning would shake the very foundations of everything she believed about justice and mercy. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're cleaning a kitchen, folding clothes, or heading home after a long day. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will surprise you. The morning mist clung to the windows of the Hale mansion like ghostly fingers, and Rosa's breath created small clouds in the chilly air as she unlocked the service entrance at 5:30 sharp. Her worn sneakers squeaked against the polished marble floors, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over the past 8 months. The eucalyptus-scented cleaning solution she carried mixed with the faint aroma of expensive leather and old wood that permeated every corner of this $20 million fortress overlooking the San Francisco Bay. Rosa's hands, weathered by 43 years of relentless labor, trembled slightly as she set down her cleaning caddy. Not from cold, but from the weight of memories that this place stirred within her. Each morning, she walked through rooms that cost more than entire city blocks in her beloved Mission District, where colorful murals told stories of struggle and triumph, where the scent of fresh tortillas mingled with the distant roar of BART trains carrying working souls to another day of survival. Victor Hale's empire stretched across California's tech industry, his investment portfolio swollen with cryptocurrency gains and stock market triumphs that had made him one of the Bay Area's most formidable billionaires. His penthouse office downtown commanded views of both bridges, while his mansion sat perched like a crown jewel among the elite residences where old money whispered secrets through manicured gardens. But wealth, Rosa had learned, could not fill the hollow spaces in a man's chest where his heart used to beat freely. Victor moved through his mansion like a shadow of himself, his expensive Italian suits hanging loose on shoulders that once carried confidence like armor. His wife, Elena's sudden death from a brain aneurysm 13 months ago, had transformed him from a charismatic business mogul into a bitter recluse who viewed every human interaction through the lens of potential loss. The mansion's silence was oppressive, broken only by the grandfather clock in the foyer, each tick marking time that felt suspended, frozen in grief. Crystal chandeliers caught the morning light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting rainbow fractals across walls adorned with priceless art that no one bothered to admire anymore. Rosa often wondered if beauty could die from neglect, the way flowers wilted when no one remembered to water them. Her own journey to this place had begun 6 months earlier, when the weight of unpaid medical bills and her elderly mother's mounting healthcare needs had forced her to leave the warm chaos of her neighborhood for the cold precision of Pacific Heights. She had ridden 3 different buses, transferring twice, clutching a manila folder containing her references and a prayer that this job might finally provide the stability her family desperately needed. Rosa remembered that first interview, how her reflection looked small and insignificant in the mansion's grand entryway. Victor had barely glanced at her, his steel-gray eyes focused on documents that represented millions in quarterly profits, while she stood quietly, her modest dress and worn purse marking her as clearly as if she wore a sign declaring her economic status. The previous cleaning staff had abandoned their posts after whispers of Victor's explosive temper, and impossible standards had spread through the domestic worker network that connected San Francisco's invisible army of caregivers and cleaners. "You'll work alone," he had said without looking up, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from boardrooms where billion-dollar deals were struck with handshakes. "I don't want chatter. I don't want disruption. Clean efficiently, invisibly, and stay out of areas marked private. Your salary will be competitive, but my expectations are absolute." Rosa had nodded, understanding that she was being hired not as a person, but as a function, a necessary inconvenience in a house that had forgotten how to feel. The morning light was growing stronger now, illuminating the dust motes that danced through the air like tiny spirits. Rosa began her routine in the kitchen, a space that could have served a five-star restaurant but felt as sterile as an operating room. Granite countertops worth more than her annual salary stretched across an island where gourmet meals were prepared by a private chef who arrived precisely at noon and departed by 7, leaving behind pristine surfaces that Rosa would polish until they gleamed like dark mirrors. She moved methodically from room to room, her presence as quiet as prayer. In the library, leather-bound first editions lined mahogany shelves that reached toward a coffered ceiling painted by artisans whose names were whispered in art circles. The Persian rugs beneath her feet had been hand-woven by masters whose techniques were passed down through generations, each thread carrying stories of distant lands and ancient traditions. But despite the overwhelming wealth that surrounded her, Rosa felt the mansion's essential poverty. The absence of laughter, the lack of casual conversation, the missing warmth that transformed houses into homes. She had grown up in a cramped apartment where 5 people shared 2 bedrooms, where her mother's voice carried through thin walls like a song, where neighbors borrowed sugar and shared gossip over steaming cups of café con leche. That apartment, with its cracked linoleum and water-stained ceiling, had possessed something this mansion lacked: life itself. As she dusted the mantelpiece in Victor's study, Rosa caught glimpses of family photographs that told a story of before and after. Images of Victor and Elena at charity galas, their smiles bright and genuine. Pictures of family vacations where sun-kissed faces radiated joy and possibility. And then, abruptly, the photographs stopped, as if happiness itself had been amputated from their lives. Victor's adult children visited rarely, their relationships with their father strained by his transformation from loving patriarch to bitter hermit, who seemed to blame the world for his loss. When they did appear, usually for obligatory holidays or business matters, the mansion filled with tension thick enough to cut. Rosa would retreat to the service areas during these visits, listening to muffled arguments about inheritance and responsibility, about a father who had become unreachable behind walls of grief and growing paranoia. The morning routine continued as Rosa made her way to the master suite, a space that felt like a mausoleum to lost love. Victor's king-sized bed was always perfectly made despite being slept in, as if he approached even rest with the same rigid control he applied to his business empire. Elena's side of the vast walk-in closet remained untouched, her clothes hanging like ghosts of a woman who would never again choose between the sapphire blue dress or the emerald green evening gown. Rosa's heart ached for this kind of loss, though her own grief had taken different forms. She understood the way sorrow could transform a person's entire relationship with the world, how it could make kindness feel like weakness and trust seem like luxury that couldn't be afforded. As she cleaned the ensuite bathroom, with its marble surfaces and gold fixtures that probably cost more than most people's cars, Rosa allowed herself a moment of reflection in the vanity mirror. Her face showed the accumulated wisdom of struggle, lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent caring for sick family members, calloused hands that had worked every job from restaurant dishwasher to hospital janitor, a posture that remained upright despite years of bending and bowing to others' needs. The morning was progressing normally until Rosa heard an unusual sound echoing from the direction of the library, a low groan that didn't belong in the mansion's carefully orchestrated silence. She paused, her cleaning cloth suspended mid-motion, listening intently to distinguish between the normal creaks and settling sounds of the old house and something that might require attention. There it was again, definitely human and definitely distressed. Rosa set down her supplies and moved quietly toward the sound, her natural instinct to help overriding any concerns about venturing into areas where she might not be welcome. As she approached the library's heavy oak doors, the groaning became more distinct, accompanied by what sounded like labored breathing. She pushed open the door and found herself looking at a scene that would be forever burned into her memory. A man in a police uniform lay sprawled across the Persian carpet, his face pale and twisted in pain. A dark stain spreading across his shirt from what appeared to be a knife wound in his side. His radio crackled with static, and his service weapon lay several feet away, as if it had been knocked from his grasp during a struggle. Rosa's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. In that frozen moment, she recognized Officer Mark Stevens. She had seen him several times over the past months, usually arriving in the evenings for what appeared to be private meetings with Victor. He was a decorated member of the San Francisco Police Department, a man whose weathered face and gentle manner had always reminded her of her own father, before life's disappointments had hardened his heart. Without hesitation, Rosa dropped to her knees beside the injured officer, her hands automatically moving to assess the wound, with the kind of practical knowledge that comes from raising children and caring for elderly relatives in a community where medical care was often a luxury. The knife wound was deep, but appeared to have missed vital organs, though blood loss was becoming a serious concern. "Officer Stevens, can you hear me?" Rosa whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around her. She pressed her apron against the wound, applying pressure while reaching for her cell phone with her free hand. Mark's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and cloudy with pain. "Rosa," he managed to gasp, recognition flickering across his features. Don't trust Victor." His words sent a chill through Rosa that had nothing to do with the morning fog still clinging to the windows. Rosa Martinez had arrived at the Hale Mansion 8 months earlier on a Tuesday morning that felt like stepping through a portal into another universe. The contrast between her world and this one had been so stark that she'd actually paused on the marble steps, questioning whether she belonged in a place where the doorknobs cost more than her monthly rent. Her journey from the Mission District had begun at 4 in the morning, starting with a walk through streets where murals told stories of Cesar Chavez and Frida Kahlo, where the aroma of fresh pan dulce mingled with the sounds of vendors calling out in rapid Spanish. She'd caught the first bus of the day, watching the city transform through smudged windows as working-class neighborhoods gave way to the manicured perfection of Pacific Heights. The employment agency had called her the evening before, their voice tinged with the kind of caution that comes with difficult placements. "Mrs. Martinez, we have a position that pays exceptionally well, but we need to be transparent about the challenges. Mr. Hale is particular. He's lost several cleaning staff in the past 6 months, not because of inadequate work, but because of personality conflicts. He's been through a tremendous loss, and it's changed him." Rosa had listened quietly, calculating in her head whether the salary they quoted could finally allow her to catch up on her mother's medical bills, and maybe even set aside something for the future. At 51, she had learned that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford when her family's survival was at stake. The mansion had loomed before her like something from a movie, its stone facade and perfectly symmetrical windows speaking of money that had been accumulating for generations. The circular driveway could have accommodated a dozen cars, and the landscaping looked like it required a team of professionals to maintain its pristine appearance. Victor had kept her waiting in the foyer for 27 minutes. She'd counted each one while standing on marble that reflected her modest appearance like a funhouse mirror. When he finally appeared, descending the curved staircase with the authority of a man accustomed to others waiting for his convenience, Rosa had felt the full weight of their different worlds. "You're the candidate from the agency," he had said without preamble, his voice carrying the kind of coolness that comes from years of treating human beings like line items on a balance sheet. He was younger than she'd expected, probably mid-40s, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that looked like they hadn't registered genuine warmth in months. "Yes, sir, Rosa Martinez." She'd offered her hand, which he'd shaken briefly with the mechanical precision of someone fulfilling a social obligation rather than making human contact. The interview had been conducted in his study, a room lined with awards and photographs that chronicled a life of increasing financial success. Forbes magazine covers featuring Victor's face, handshake photographs with mayors and senators, certificates documenting charitable contributions that probably exceeded Rosa's lifetime earnings. But what struck her most was what was missing. Recent family photographs, signs of personal joy. Anything that suggested this was a place where life was actually lived rather than simply endured. "I require perfection," Victor had explained, his fingers drumming against a mahogany desk that probably cost more than Rosa's car. "This house represents significant investment of time and resources. Every surface, every detail, every aspect of its maintenance must reflect that investment. I will not tolerate carelessness, gossip, or intrusion into my privacy. You'll work alone, follow detailed instructions, and maintain absolute discretion about anything you might observe." Rosa had nodded, understanding that she was being hired to be invisible, to perform her duties like a ghost who left no trace except perfectly clean surfaces and restored order. The salary he mentioned was indeed generous by the standards of domestic work, but she sensed there would be hidden costs that couldn't be measured in dollars. "The previous staff left suddenly," Victor had continued, his tone suggesting this was somehow their failing rather than a reflection of his impossible standards. "I need someone reliable, someone who understands that this position requires absolute professionalism." What he hadn't mentioned was that reliable meant absorbing his grief-fueled anger when quarterly reports disappointed him, that professional meant pretending not to notice when he stood by Elena's portrait at midnight, whispering conversations with a woman who would never answer back, that absolute discretion meant witnessing the slow disintegration of a man who had everything except the one thing that mattered most. Rosa's first month had been a careful dance of learning Victor's unspoken rules while navigating a household where emotional landmines were buried beneath the surface of everyday interactions. She discovered that certain rooms were completely off-limits, not because they contained valuable items, but because they held too many memories. Elena's craft room, where half-finished watercolors still sat on easels, waiting for an artist who would never return. The music room, where a grand piano collected dust because Victor couldn't bear to hear the songs his wife used to play. The mansion's other staff members treated Rosa with the kind of polite distance that comes from knowing that domestic workers were easily replaceable. The chef, Marcus, was a graduate of culinary school whose talents were wasted on a man who barely tasted the elaborate meals he prepared. The groundskeeper, an elderly Irish immigrant named Sean, tended gardens that no one walked through anymore. The part-time secretary who handled Victor's correspondence worked from a downtown office, maintaining professional distance from the emotional wreckage of the household. In those early weeks, Rosa had watched Victor transform from a successful businessman into something resembling a character from a 19th century novel, brooding, isolated, suspicious of everyone's motives except his own. His morning routine involved scanning financial reports over coffee that grew cold while he stared out windows that offered million-dollar views of San Francisco Bay. His evenings were spent in his study, reviewing investment portfolios and cryptocurrency holdings that continued to generate wealth even as his capacity for happiness withered. The mansion itself seemed to reflect its owner's emotional state. Despite Rosa's meticulous cleaning, despite the fresh flowers she arranged in crystal vases, despite her efforts to maintain the warmth that a home should possess, the space felt hollow and cold. Sound echoed strangely in rooms that were too large and too empty, and silence seemed to accumulate in corners like dust that couldn't be swept away. Rosa had begun to understand that she wasn't just cleaning a house. She was maintaining a monument to loss, a shrine to the cruel unpredictability of life that could steal away love without warning. Every day, she moved through rooms where happiness had once lived, and every evening, she returned to her overcrowded apartment in the Mission District, feeling emotionally drained despite the physical nature of her work. But even as she adapted to Victor's requirements and the mansion's oppressive atmosphere, Rosa couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was wrong. She'd noticed how Victor's paranoia seemed to be intensifying, how he'd begun questioning her about conversations she'd never had, and suspecting her of actions she'd never taken. His grief was evolving into something darker, more consuming, something that was eating away at his ability to trust anyone or anything. The morning she found Officer Stevens bleeding on the library floor, Rosa realized that Victor's isolation hadn't protected him from the world's dangers. It had simply made him more vulnerable to the threats he couldn't see coming. As she knelt beside the wounded officer, applying pressure to his knife wound while dialing 911, Rosa felt the weight of whatever secrets had brought violence into this pristine sanctuary of wealth and privilege. The chaos that followed Officer Stevens' injury transformed the mansion's oppressive silence into a cacophony of sirens, shouted orders, and official procedures that Rosa had only witnessed from the outside looking in. Within minutes of her 911 call, the elegant foyer was filled with paramedics whose urgent movements seemed to violate the space's carefully maintained dignity. Rosa found herself swept aside as emergency responders took over, her hands still stained with blood from the injured officer. She stood pressed against the library wall, watching as they stabilized Mark Stevens and prepared him for transport. Her mind racing with questions about how violence had penetrated this fortress of wealth and isolation. Victor appeared as if summoned by the commotion, his face a mask of controlled fury that Rosa had learned to recognize as his default response to any situation that threatened his carefully ordered world. He surveyed the scene with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to viewing problems as challenges to be managed rather than human tragedies to be grieved. "What the hell happened here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate answers and complete deference. The lead paramedic, a weary-looking woman whose uniform suggested years of dealing with urban violence, glanced up from her patient. "Knife wound to the torso, significant blood loss but stable vitals. He was conscious when we arrived. Kept asking for someone named Victor. You're the homeowner?" Rosa watched Victor's expression shift as he processed this information, his businessman's mind already working to calculate potential exposure and liability. She could see him mentally reviewing his assets, his legal protections, his insurance coverage, everything except the human cost of whatever had brought Mark Stevens to his library floor, armed and wounded. "Officer Stevens has been consulting with me on a private matter," Victor said carefully, his tone suggesting layers of complexity that Rosa didn't understand but sensed were dangerous. The paramedic nodded professionally while securing Mark to a stretcher. "He'll need surgery, but he should recover fully. You might want to consider reviewing your security arrangements. Whoever did this might not be finished." After the emergency responders departed, taking Mark Stevens and their urgent energy with them, the mansion settled back into its customary silence. But now that silence felt different, charged with unspoken threats and hidden dangers that Rosa could feel pressing against her consciousness like physical weight. Victor stood in his violated library, surveying damage that couldn't be measured in dollars. The Persian rug would need to be replaced, the hardwood floors refinished where blood had begun to soak into wood that had been imported from sustainable forests in Oregon. But Rosa could see that his primary concern wasn't property damage. It was whatever secret Mark Stevens had been protecting, whatever investigation had brought violence into Victor's carefully controlled sanctuary. "You called 911, Victor said to Rosa, his tone neutral, but with undertones that made her suddenly aware of how isolated she was in this house with a man whose grief had been transforming him into something she didn't recognize. "Yes, sir. He was bleeding badly. I thought he might die if... Did he say anything to you?" "Before the paramedics arrived." Rosa hesitated, remembering Mark's warning about trusting Victor. But standing in this library where violence had erupted without warning, surrounded by blood-stained books and overturned furniture, she realized that loyalty and survival might require different choices. "He was mostly unconscious," she said carefully. I just tried to stop the bleeding and called for help. Victor studied her face with the intensity of a man who had built his fortune by recognizing deception in others' expressions, by calculating the reliability of business partners and the trustworthiness of employees. Rosa met his gaze steadily, drawing on decades of experience with employers who measured her worth by her compliance rather than her humanity. In the days that followed, the mansion's atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Police investigators came and went, asking questions that Victor answered with lawyer-approved precision. Rosa learned from overheard conversations that Mark Stevens had been investigating irregularities in several of Victor's business dealings, something involving cryptocurrency transfers and offshore investment accounts that existed in the gray areas between legal and criminal. The investigation revealed a web of financial complexity that stretched from San Francisco's tech industry to international markets where Bitcoin transactions occurred beyond traditional regulatory oversight. Victor's empire, built on legitimate software development and stock market investments, had apparently been supplemented by ventures that operated in legal shadows where profit margins were higher, but risks included more than market volatility. During this period of official scrutiny, Rosa witnessed a side of Victor that his business rivals and society page photographers never saw. She watched him pace his study at 3 a.m, reviewing documents that seemed to document transactions worth millions, but carried implications that clearly terrified him. She observed him during phone calls where his usual commanding tone gave way to something approaching desperation as he spoke with lawyers and accountants whose expertise involved protecting wealth from investigations rather than growing it through innovation. But it was during these tense days that Rosa also witnessed something unexpected, small gestures of humanity that seemed to emerge from Victor despite his efforts to remain coldly professional. When she brought him coffee during one particularly stressful afternoon, he actually thanked her, his voice carrying a weariness that sounded more like grief than guilt. When she worked late to restore order to the library where the attack had occurred, he insisted that she accept payment for overtime hours without being asked. These moments of basic human decency felt revolutionary in a relationship that had been defined by professional distance and class-based hierarchy. Rosa began to sense that beneath Victor's armor of wealth and control was a man who had lost more than his wife. He had lost his ability to trust his own judgment about people and circumstances. The breakthrough came during the 3rd week after the attack, when Rosa was working in Elena's former art studio, a sun-filled room on the mansion's 2nd floor where canvases still waited for paint that would never be applied to them. She had been instructed to pack away Elena's art supplies, a task that felt like dismantling someone's dreams one brush at a time. Victor found her there, standing before an unfinished watercolor of the Golden Gate Bridge emerging from morning fog. The painting captured something essential about San Francisco's beauty, the way light and mist could transform urban landscape into something approaching the sacred. She never finished it, Victor said quietly, his voice carrying a vulnerability that Rosa had never heard before. She always said she was waiting for the perfect day to capture the exact way light hits the water at sunrise. But perfect days are rarer than we think when we're planning for them. Rosa continued packing art supplies into boxes that would probably end up in climate-controlled storage, artifacts of a woman whose creativity had been interrupted by mortality's arbitrary schedule. But she listened to Victor's words and heard something beyond grief. She heard regret for time that had been wasted on lesser concerns, while life's genuine treasures remained unfinished. "My mother always told me that perfect is the enemy of done," Rosa said softly, not looking up from her work, but speaking with the kind of quiet wisdom that comes from a lifetime of making the best of imperfect circumstances. She said waiting for perfect conditions usually means never starting at all. Victor was quiet for so long that Rosa wondered if she had overstepped some invisible boundary by offering unsolicited philosophy. But when she glanced up, she saw him studying Elena's unfinished painting with an expression that suggested he was seeing it differently, perhaps recognizing parallels between artistic paralysis and emotional isolation. Rosa's first genuine act of humanity toward Victor came not through words but through a simple gesture that acknowledged his loss without trying to fix it. The next morning, when she brought his coffee to the study, she also brought a small glass of water containing a single white orchid bloom that she had carefully cut from the mansion's greenhouse. "In my neighborhood, we put flowers by photographs of people we miss," she explained quietly, placing the simple arrangement beside a formal portrait of Elena that dominated Victor's desk. "Not to replace them, but to remind us that beautiful things can still grow even when we're sad." Victor stared at the humble flower as if it were some exotic artifact whose meaning required careful interpretation. Rosa could see him struggling with emotions that his grief had kept frozen, calculating the implications of accepting kindness from someone whose social position made her invisible in his usual worldview. But when she encountered him the next morning, the orchid was still there, and beside it was a second bloom that he had apparently added himself. The slow transformation of Victor Hale began with small concessions to humanity that seemed to surprise him as much as they touched Rosa. The rigid schedule that had governed the mansion's daily routine became slightly more flexible. The coldly professional tone he used when giving Rosa instructions was gradually replaced by something approaching normal human conversation. Rosa began to feel less like a ghost, haunting the mansion's perfectly appointed rooms, and more like a witness to a man's struggle to reconnect with his capacity for human feeling. She watched Victor rediscover simple pleasures that his grief had obscured, the taste of food rather than just its nutritional content, the beauty of sunrise over San Francisco Bay rather than just its market implications for his various investment portfolios. The mansion itself seemed to respond to this subtle shift in emotional climate. Rooms that had felt like museum exhibits began to feel more lived in. The oppressive silence was gradually replaced by sounds of normal life, music playing softly in the background, occasional laughter during phone calls with business associates, even the simple pleasure of Victor humming while reviewing morning reports. Rosa had begun to hope that perhaps wealth and isolation didn't have to be permanent barriers to human connection, that maybe grief could evolve into something that allowed for new forms of joy. She had started to believe that her presence in this mansion might be serving a purpose beyond mere cleaning and maintenance, that maybe she was helping to restore something more valuable than crystal chandeliers and marble surfaces. But she was about to discover that in worlds where millions of dollars change hands through cryptocurrency transactions and offshore investment schemes, trust becomes the most dangerous luxury of all. The transformation Rosa witnessed in Victor over the following months felt like watching winter gradually yield to spring, subtle at first, then increasingly obvious as warmth returned to spaces that had been frozen in grief. The mansion's oppressive silence began to lift, replaced by sounds of life slowly returning, classical music drifting from the library while Victor worked, occasional phone calls where his laughter suggested conversations that went beyond business calculations, even the simple pleasure of him humming while reviewing investment reports that documented his cryptocurrency portfolio's continued growth. Rosa found herself becoming more than just a cleaning service. She was evolving into something approaching a confidant, someone whose quiet presence provided comfort without demanding explanation or emotional reciprocity. Their conversations, initially limited to practical matters about household maintenance, gradually expanded to include observations about the weather, comments about news events, and eventually carefully shared memories about Elena that Victor had been carrying alone for too long. One morning in early spring, while Rosa arranged fresh flowers in the foyer, Victor paused on his way to his study and actually asked about her family, a question that acknowledged her existence beyond her function in his household. She told him about her mother's ongoing health struggles, about the community center where she volunteered on weekends teaching English to recent immigrants, about the small apartment in the Mission District where 3 generations lived together with more love than space. It sounds crowded, Victor observed, but without the dismissive tone Rosa might have expected from someone whose mansion contained more space than most families could imagine needing. It is, Rosa agreed, but crowded can be another word for full. When my grandson practices violin in the kitchen while my mother tells stories in Spanish and my daughter cooks dinner, all at the same time, the noise is actually beautiful. It means everyone has a voice. Victor processed this perspective with the thoughtfulness of someone encountering a foreign concept that might contain valuable insights. His mansion, with its perfect acoustics and carefully arranged silence, suddenly seemed less like luxury and more like isolation. As spring progressed into summer, Rosa noticed that Victor was beginning to venture into rooms he had avoided since Elena's death. The music room, where dust had accumulated on the piano keys, began to show signs of use. The garden patio, previously maintained but never occupied, became a place where Victor took his morning coffee while reading reports about his various investments and properties. Most significantly, Victor began to engage with his adult children again. His son David, a software engineer who had inherited his father's analytical mind but possessed Elena's warmth, started visiting regularly rather than only appearing for obligatory holidays. His daughter Sarah, whose art gallery in Los Angeles had been struggling financially, accepted her father's offer of investment capital for the first time in years, and their conversations were no longer limited to stilted exchanges about business matters. Rosa watched this family healing with the satisfaction of someone who understood the value of patient nurturing. She had witnessed similar transformations in her own community, where grief and hardship were constant companions, but where resilience and interconnection provided paths toward renewal. She recognized that wealth couldn't purchase emotional healing, but it could provide the stability needed for healing to occur naturally. During this period, Rosa also began to understand more about Victor's business empire and the complex relationships that sustained his considerable fortune. Through overheard phone calls and occasional glimpses of financial documents, she learned that his success involved far more than the software development company that had made his initial fortune. His investment portfolio included cryptocurrency holdings worth hundreds of millions, real estate properties across California and Nevada, and venture capital stakes in emerging technology companies that existed at the intersection of innovation and speculation. But she also sensed undercurrents of complexity that went beyond normal business risks. Victor's conversations with his lawyers had an urgency that suggested ongoing legal challenges. His financial advisors spoke in coded language about offshore restructuring and cryptocurrency diversification strategies that seemed designed to protect assets from regulatory scrutiny rather than simply maximize returns. The relationship between Victor and Officer Mark Stevens, who had recovered from his injuries and returned to active duty, remained tense and formal. Rosa observed their occasional meetings, which occurred in Victor's study with doors closed and voices kept deliberately low. She could sense that Mark's investigation into Victor's business dealings had uncovered information that created ongoing tension between legal obligation and personal loyalty. It was during one of these meetings that Rosa accidentally overheard a conversation that would haunt her for weeks. While cleaning the hallway outside Victor's study, she heard Mark's voice raised in frustration. The cryptocurrency transfers match exactly with the timeline of the construction permits. This isn't coincidence, Victor. Someone with access to city planning documents made billions by purchasing properties through shell companies before development announcements were made public. Victor's response was quieter, but Rosa could hear the strain in his voice. I've followed every legal requirement. My investment advisors handle cryptocurrency portfolios worth hundreds of millions. If some of those transactions happen to align with profitable opportunities, that's successful business strategy, not criminal activity. Rosa understood enough about insider trading and corruption to recognize that the conversation she was overhearing described activities that existed in the gray areas between legal and criminal. She also understood that her position in Victor's household made her a potential witness to information that people killed to protect. That realization should have terrified her, but instead it clarified something she had been sensing without fully understanding. Victor's transformation from grief-stricken recluse to someone capable of human connection again wasn't just about healing from emotional loss. It was also about finding the courage to face consequences for choices that had been made when grief and anger had clouded his judgment about acceptable risks. The crisis that would test Rosa's understanding of loyalty and justice arrived on a Tuesday morning in late July when San Francisco fog was just beginning to lift from the mansion's perfectly maintained gardens. Rosa was in the kitchen, preparing fresh flower arrangements that had become one of her favorite additions to the household routine, when she heard raised voices coming from the study. This wasn't the controlled tension of business discussions or legal consultations. This was raw anger and fear, emotions that Victor had been keeping carefully contained for months. Rosa recognized the voices of his sister-in-law, Patricia, and her husband, James, relatives who visited rarely and always seemed to bring tension with them. "You're going to destroy everything Elena worked to build," Patricia's voice carried clearly through the mansion's acoustics, sharp with accusation and panic. "Do you think she would want her name associated with insider trading scandals? Do you think she would want her family's reputation destroyed because you couldn't resist making even more money than you already had?" James's voice was lower, but equally angry. "The FBI is investigating cryptocurrency transactions that trace back to your investment accounts. They know about the property purchases, the construction permits, the timing of everything. When this becomes public, Elena's charitable foundation will be destroyed along with your business empire." Rosa found herself frozen in place, holding white orchids that suddenly seemed inappropriate for a house where threats and recriminations were being exchanged like weapons. She wanted to leave, to avoid overhearing more information that made her a potential target. But she was trapped by the layout of the mansion that provided no escape route from the kitchen that wouldn't require passing by the study. Victor's response, when it came, carried a weariness that Rosa recognized from their gradual relationship over the past months. "Elena would want me to take responsibility for my choices. She would want me to protect the people who depend on me, including employees who trusted me to provide stable employment. If accepting consequences means losing the fortune we built together, then maybe that's the price of redemption." The conversation that followed revealed the full scope of Victor's legal and financial vulnerabilities. The cryptocurrency investments that had generated hundreds of millions in profits had been guided by information obtained through corruption networks that extended deep into San Francisco's political and development systems. Properties worth billions had been purchased through shell companies that existed primarily to obscure the source of insider information that made those purchases profitable with mathematical precision. But Rosa also heard something else in Victor's voice, a recognition that the emotional healing he had experienced over the past months had restored his ability to distinguish between legal success and ethical behavior. The man who had hired her 8 months ago might have continued fighting to protect his wealth regardless of the human cost. The man she was overhearing now seemed prepared to accept responsibility for choices made when grief had overwhelmed his moral judgment. Patricia's final words before leaving contained a threat that would transform Rosa from invisible employee to reluctant participant in family warfare. "If you won't protect Elena's legacy, then we'll find other ways to preserve what matters. There are people in this house who understand more than you think they do. Information can come from sources you don't control." After Victor's relatives departed, the mansion settled into an ominous quiet that felt different from its previous peaceful silence. Rosa sensed that she had become a liability in ways she didn't fully understand, someone whose presence during sensitive conversations made her either an asset to be protected or a threat to be eliminated. That evening, as Rosa prepared to leave for her usual commute back to the Mission District, Victor approached her in the kitchen where she was packing her cleaning supplies. His expression combined gratitude with something approaching apology. as if he recognized that her employment in his household had exposed her to dangers she hadn't chosen. "Rosa," he said quietly, "I want you to know that whatever happens in the coming weeks, you've given me something I didn't think I could find again. You've helped me remember that wealth without humanity is just elaborate poverty." Rosa studied his face and recognized the expression of someone preparing for battle against opponents who fought with weapons he was only beginning to understand. "Mr. Hale, if you need someone to truthfully describe what they've witnessed, I can do that. If you need someone to disappear quietly, I can do that too. But I won't lie for you, and I won't lie about you." Victor nodded, understanding that Rosa's loyalty had boundaries that were defined by integrity rather than financial obligation. "I wouldn't ask you to lie. Elena always said that truth was the only foundation strong enough to build real happiness on." As Rosa walked to the bus stop that evening, she felt the weight of knowledge that made her both valuable and vulnerable to people whose fortunes depended on secrets remaining buried. She also felt something else, pride in her employer's transformation from bitter recluse to someone capable of accepting responsibility for mistakes made when grief had clouded his judgment about acceptable risks. She didn't know that within 48 hours, she would be forced to choose between protecting herself and protecting the man whose humanity she had helped restore. The betrayal came on a Thursday morning when autumn fog clung to Pacific Heights like a shroud, obscuring the mansion's perfect views and creating an atmosphere thick with hidden threats. Rosa arrived for work at her usual time, but something felt wrong from the moment she unlocked the service entrance, an electric tension in the air that reminded her of moments before severe storms when the atmosphere itself seemed charged with impending violence. Victor was already in his study, surrounded by legal documents and financial statements that covered every surface of the mahogany desk Elena had helped him choose during happier years. His appearance suggested he had been working through the night, his usually impeccable grooming replaced by the disheveled look of someone wrestling with decisions that would determine his future. "Rosa," he said without looking up from papers that documented cryptocurrency transactions worth hundreds of millions, "I want you to know that whatever happens today, you've been the most honest person in my life since Elena died. That's worth more than any salary I could pay you." Before Rosa could respond, the sound of multiple vehicles pulling into the circular driveway announced the arrival of visitors who hadn't been invited but couldn't be refused. Through the foyer windows, Rosa could see FBI vehicles, their official presence turning Victor's private sanctuary into the scene of a law enforcement operation that had been months in preparation. The federal agents who entered the mansion carried themselves with the professional efficiency of people executing a carefully planned operation. They displayed warrants that authorized seizure of financial records, computer equipment, and any documents related to cryptocurrency investments or real estate transactions that might have involved insider trading or corruption. Rosa found herself pressed against the kitchen wall, trying to remain invisible while law enforcement officers systematically cataloged evidence that would either exonerate Victor or destroy him. She watched as agents photographed rooms where she had worked quietly for months, where she had witnessed Victor's gradual transformation from bitter recluse to someone capable of human connection again. But the morning's most devastating blow came not from federal investigators, but from Patricia and James, who arrived while the search was still in progress. Rosa realized immediately that Victor's sister-in-law had been the source of information that made this raid possible, that she had traded her brother-in-law's freedom for protection of Elena's charitable foundation and the family fortune that supported multiple generations of comfortable living. "You forced our hand," Patricia told Victor while FBI agents cataloged financial documents in the background. "Elena's legacy won't be destroyed by your greed. The foundation's assets are protected through legal structures you can't access, and the family trusts are beyond the reach of criminal forfeiture proceedings." Rosa watched Victor process his sister-in-law's betrayal with the stoic resignation of someone who had been expecting treachery, but still felt wounded by its arrival. His expression combined disappointment with something approaching relief, as if the burden of carrying secrets alone was finally being lifted from shoulders that had been bowed under its weight for too long. But Patricia wasn't finished. Her next words were directed at Rosa with malicious precision. The cleaning woman knows more than she admits. She's been eavesdropping on private conversations, collecting information that could be valuable to prosecutors or defense attorneys, depending on who pays her more. She's not as innocent as she pretends to be. The accusation hit Rosa like a physical blow, transforming her from invisible observer to central target of suspicions that could destroy her reputation in San Francisco's domestic worker community. She understood immediately that Patricia was creating a narrative that painted Rosa as either complicit in Victor's alleged crimes or willing to sell information to the highest bidder. Victor's response surprised everyone present, including Rosa herself. His voice, when he spoke, carried an authority that reminded observers why he had been successful in business arenas where million-dollar decisions were made through force of personality rather than just financial analysis. Rosa Martinez has shown more integrity in 8 months than most people demonstrate in their entire careers, he said clearly, his words intended for FBI agents whose reports would become official records. She has worked honestly, served faithfully, and maintained discretion about private family matters that would be gossip in less principled hands. Any suggestion that she has behaved unethically is a malicious lie designed to deflect attention from actual wrongdoing. Rosa felt tears threatening for the first time since this ordeal began, not from fear or sadness, but from gratitude toward an employer who had chosen to defend her character when he could have easily sacrificed her to protect himself. But she also understood that Victor's defense of her integrity had probably just made her more valuable to prosecutors who would want to verify his claims about her honesty and discretion. She was now a witness whose testimony could either support or contradict whatever narrative emerged from the investigation into Victor's business dealings. The FBI search continued for hours, with agents methodically photographing and cataloging evidence, while Rosa worked quietly in areas that weren't being actively investigated. She found herself cleaning rooms where federal officers were documenting potential crimes, maintaining some sense of normal routine while her employer's world was systematically dismantled. By afternoon, the agents had completed their evidence collection and departed, leaving behind a mansion that felt violated and empty. Victor sat in his study, surrounded by empty filing cabinets and computer equipment that had been replaced by official receipts documenting what had been seized for analysis. "Rosa," he said when she approached to see if he needed anything, "I want you to take the next few days off. With pay, of course. This house isn't going to feel safe or comfortable for anyone until we understand what comes next." Rosa studied his expression and recognized the look of someone preparing for consequences that might include prison sentences measured in years rather than months. She also saw something else, a man who had rediscovered his ability to care about other people's welfare, even when his own future was uncertain. "Mr. Hale, if they ask me questions, I'll tell them the truth about what I've seen and heard. But my truth is that you've treated me with more respect than most employers, and that you've been trying to make things right even when it costs you personally." Victor nodded, understanding that Rosa's testimony might be one of the few character references available to him from sources that prosecutors would consider credible. Elena always said that how we treat people with no power to help or hurt us reveals our true character. I hope I've learned something from her example. As Rosa prepared to leave the mansion that afternoon, she realized she might never see this place again. The investigation could result in asset forfeiture proceedings that would transfer ownership to federal authorities, or Victor might need to sell properties to pay legal fees that could consume fortunes measured in hundreds of millions. But walking through rooms where she had worked quietly for months, Rosa felt proud of her role in Victor's transformation, from bitter recluse to someone capable of accepting responsibility for his mistakes while still defending others from undeserved blame. She had witnessed the slow healing of a man whose grief had temporarily overwhelmed his moral judgment, and she had helped create an environment where that healing could occur. The bus ride back to the Mission District gave Rosa time to process the day's events and their implications for her own future. Federal prosecutors might want her testimony about conversations she had overheard, financial documents she had seen, or behavioral patterns she had observed. Defense attorneys might offer payment for information that could help establish Victor's character or credibility. But Rosa had already made the crucial decision that would guide her through whatever legal proceedings lay ahead. She would tell the truth, as she understood it, without embellishment or omission, regardless of whether that truth helped or hindered any particular side's arguments. Elena's example, as transmitted through Victor's gradual healing, had taught her that integrity was the only foundation strong enough to support real happiness. That evening, as Rosa sat in her crowded apartment surrounded by 3 generations of family, sharing more love than space, she reflected on the privilege of witnessing someone's redemption, even as his world was being systematically dismantled. She had learned that wealth could not purchase immunity from consequence, but it could provide resources for accepting responsibility with dignity. She didn't yet know that her testimony would become crucial evidence in legal proceedings that would determine whether Victor's transformation was genuine enough to deserve consideration during sentencing, or whether his defense of her character would influence prosecutors' assessment of his credibility and remorse. The revelation that would restore Victor's reputation and vindicate Rosa's faith in his character came 3 weeks later through sources that neither of them had anticipated. While federal prosecutors were building their case based on cryptocurrency transaction records and financial documents seized from the mansion, Officer Mark Stevens was conducting his own investigation into corruption networks that extended far beyond Victor's business dealings. Mark's recovery from the knife attack had been complicated by infections that required additional surgery and extended hospitalization, but his determination to complete the investigation that had nearly cost his life had only intensified. From his hospital bed, he had been coordinating with FBI financial crime specialists and San Francisco District Attorney investigators to trace the flow of insider information that had made billions in illegal profits possible. The breakthrough came when digital forensics experts analyzing cryptocurrency transactions discovered patterns that revealed the true scope of the corruption network. Victor's investments, while extraordinarily profitable, represented only a small fraction of the insider trading operation that had been systematically looting San Francisco's development boom for nearly a decade. The real criminals were Patricia and James, who had been using Elena's charitable foundation as a money laundering operation, while simultaneously operating shell companies that purchased properties based on advanced knowledge of city planning decisions. Their accusations against Victor had been designed to deflect attention from their own far more extensive criminal activities. Rosa learned about these developments when Victor called her personally, his voice carrying excitement and relief that she hadn't heard since Elena's death had transformed him from confident businessman to grieving recluse. "Rosa, you need to know that the investigation has cleared me of criminal wrongdoing. More than that, it's revealed that Patricia and James have been stealing from Elena's foundation for years, using her memory to cover their own corruption. The FBI wants to talk to you as a witness, but as someone who can help prosecute the real criminals, not as someone suspected of any wrongdoing." The phone call continued, with Victor explaining that federal investigators had discovered evidence of threats made against Rosa, recordings of conversations where Patricia and James had discussed ways to discredit her testimony or buy her silence. The knife attack on Officer Stevens had been orchestrated by associates of Victor's relatives who had been desperate to prevent the investigation from exposing their systematic theft from charitable funds intended to help low-income families in San Francisco. They were never trying to protect Elena's legacy, Victor said, his voice carrying anger that had nothing to do with personal vindication and everything to do with betrayal of his wife's charitable goals. They were using her foundation to steal money from programs that fed homeless families and provided scholarships for immigrant children. Elena would be heartbroken to know that her name was being used to cover such cruelty. Rosa's testimony to federal prosecutors and FBI investigators became a crucial component of the case against Patricia and James, whose network had stolen millions in charitable donations while simultaneously profiting from insider trading schemes that had distorted San Francisco's housing market for years. Her detailed observations of conversations and behaviors had provided investigators with timeline information that corroborated financial evidence and helped establish the scope of the criminal conspiracy. But more importantly, Rosa's testimony had confirmed the authenticity of Victor's transformation from bitter recluse to someone capable of accepting responsibility for his mistakes. Prosecutors who had initially suspected Victor of being the criminal mastermind gradually recognized that his grief and isolation had made him a target for relatives who had exploited his emotional vulnerability while conducting far more extensive criminal activities. The reunion between Rosa and Victor occurred not in the mansion, but in the downtown federal building where both had been testifying in legal proceedings that would ultimately send Patricia and James to prison for decades. They met in a hallway outside the prosecutor's office, two people whose lives had been intertwined by circumstances that neither had chosen, but both had navigated with integrity. "Rosa," Victor said quietly, "I owe you an apology for bringing danger into your life. When I hired you, I thought I was just getting help with cleaning and household management. I didn't realize I was inviting someone to witness my redemption or to risk their safety to protect my character." Rosa studied his expression and recognized the man she had helped nurture back to humanity over months of patient service and quiet dignity. "Mr. Hale, you don't owe me any apologies. You defended me when it would have been easier to let them blame me for things I didn't do. You protected my reputation when your own was under attack. That's more than most employers would do." They stood together in that institutional hallway, two people from different worlds who had discovered that grief and grace could be shared across boundaries of class and wealth and background. Rosa understood that she had played a role in Victor's emotional healing that went far beyond her job description, and Victor recognized that Rosa's integrity had helped save him from legal consequences while teaching him lessons about dignity that couldn't be purchased with any amount of money. The legal proceedings that followed resulted in complete exoneration for Victor and lengthy prison sentences for Patricia and James, whose corruption had stolen funds from charitable programs while artificially inflating property values that made housing less affordable for working families throughout San Francisco. Elena's charitable foundation was restructured under court supervision to ensure that donations would actually reach their intended recipients. Victor's business empire, while damaged by the investigation and legal expenses, survived with its core assets intact. His cryptocurrency investments, though reduced by legal fees and restitution payments to defrauded charitable organizations, left him still wealthy beyond most people's comprehension. More importantly, the investigation had cleared his reputation and relationships with his adult children, who had learned that their father's transformation from grief to grace had been genuine. But the most significant outcome of the entire ordeal was the recognition that wealth without integrity was meaningless, while dignity maintained under pressure was priceless. Rosa had demonstrated that honesty and loyalty were forms of strength that couldn't be purchased or intimidated, while Victor had learned that accepting responsibility for mistakes was the first step toward redemption. The mansion in Pacific Heights was no longer a monument to loss, but a home where laughter and music had returned. Rosa continued working there, but their relationship had evolved from employer-employee to something approaching mutual respect and affection that transcended boundaries of class and background. On mornings when San Francisco fog lifted from the bay to reveal golden sunshine illuminating the city's hills and valleys, Rosa would catch Victor standing by his study windows with an expression of quiet gratitude rather than bitter isolation. He had learned to appreciate beauty again, to find meaning in simple pleasures, to treat employees and business associates with the kind of respect that Elena had always modeled. The mansion's rooms, once cold and museum-like, now felt lived in and welcoming. Fresh flowers appeared regularly, their colors and fragrances bringing life to spaces that had been frozen in grief. Music played softly throughout the house, mainly classical pieces that Elena had loved, but occasionally jazz or folk songs that reflected Rosa's cultural background and musical preferences. Victor's adult children visited frequently now, bringing grandchildren whose laughter echoed through hallways where silence had once reigned supreme. Family dinners were warm and genuine rather than obligatory performances, conversations that explored real emotions rather than superficial pleasantries. The transformation was perhaps most visible in Victor's business practices, which had evolved to include ethical considerations that went beyond legal requirements. His investment portfolio, while still focused on profitable returns, now included criteria related to social responsibility and community development. His cryptocurrency holdings, once managed purely for maximum profit, were now structured to support blockchain technologies that could benefit underserved communities. Elena's charitable foundation, under new management and court oversight, had become genuinely effective in addressing housing and education issues that affected working families throughout the Bay Area. Victor's personal involvement in the foundation's activities had become a source of meaning that transcended financial success, connecting him to communities and causes that gave purpose to his considerable wealth. For Rosa, the entire experience had brought unexpected recognition and opportunity. Her testimony in federal court had established her reputation for integrity within San Francisco's domestic worker community, leading to job offers that reflected her proven character and reliability. But she had chosen to remain with Victor, understanding that their relationship had evolved into something approaching family connection that couldn't be replaced by higher wages or more convenient working conditions. 1 year after the federal investigation concluded, Rosa found herself arranging fresh orchids in Elena's former art studio, which had been converted into a space where light and beauty were celebrated rather than mourned. The unfinished watercolor of the Golden Gate Bridge had been professionally completed by an artist who had worked from Elena's sketches and notes, creating a painting that honored both her vision and the continuation of beauty beyond individual lives. Victor appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of contentment that would have been unimaginable during the dark months following Elena's death. He had learned to appreciate simple pleasures again, to find meaning in daily routines, to value relationships that were based on mutual respect rather than financial obligation. "Rosa," he said, offering her one of the coffee cups, "I've been thinking about something Elena used to say. She believed that angels sometimes came disguised as ordinary people doing extraordinary kindness. I think you might be proof that she was right." Rosa accepted the coffee, understanding that this moment represented the completion of a journey that had begun with grief and suspicion, but had evolved into gratitude and grace. She had helped restore humanity to someone whose wealth had isolated him from genuine human connection, while he had provided her with economic security and personal dignity that transcended typical employment relationships. "Mr. Hale," Rosa replied quietly, "I think your wife would be proud of the man you've become again. Grief doesn't have to make us smaller. Sometimes it teaches us to recognize love in forms we hadn't noticed before." They stood together in that sun-filled room, surrounded by beauty that had been preserved and renewed, understanding that redemption was possible even after profound loss, that dignity could be maintained even under pressure, that wealth's true value was measured not in dollars or properties or cryptocurrency holdings, but in its capacity to serve purposes larger than individual comfort. The healing that had begun with Rosa's simple gesture of placing a single orchid beside Elena's photograph had blossomed into something that touched every aspect of Victor's life. He had rediscovered his capacity for joy without diminishing his love for Elena, learned to honor her memory through acts of compassion rather than monuments of grief. The mansion that had once echoed with solitary footsteps now rang with the voices of children who ran through gardens where their grandmother had once painted watercolors of morning light on San Francisco Bay. Rosa's influence extended beyond the mansion's walls as well. Her reputation for integrity and quiet strength had made her a respected figure within the community of domestic workers who sustained Pacific Heights' grand houses and privileged lives. When new cleaning staff arrived from Guatemala or El Salvador, carrying hopes and fears similar to those Rosa remembered from her own early days in San Francisco, they sought her guidance about navigating relationships with employers whose wealth created barriers to understanding. She had become an unofficial advocate for fair treatment and dignified working conditions, using her relationship with Victor as an example of how respect could flourish across lines of class and culture when both parties approached each other with honesty and good faith. Her story spread through the interconnected network of nannies, gardeners, housekeepers, and caregivers who formed the invisible workforce that maintained San Francisco's most exclusive neighborhoods. Victor, meanwhile, had discovered that his transformation from isolated billionaire to engaged human being had opened doors to forms of satisfaction that his previous wealth accumulation had never provided. His involvement with Elena's restored charitable foundation had introduced him to families whose lives were genuinely improved by programs he helped fund and design. When he visited after-school programs for immigrant children or housing assistance centers for working families, he encountered gratitude that felt more meaningful than any stock market milestone or cryptocurrency surge. The mansion itself had evolved into a space that Elena might have recognized as the home she had envisioned when they first moved to Pacific Heights years earlier. The formal dining room that had been unused since her death now hosted dinner parties for foundation board members and community organizers, conversations about social justice flowing alongside wine that cost more per bottle than many families spent on groceries in a month. The music room where Elena's piano had gathered dust became a venue for small concerts benefiting local arts programs. Young musicians from Mission District schools performing for audiences who wrote checks that funded instruments and lessons. Rosa observed these changes with the satisfaction of someone whose patience and persistence had helped nurture growth that seemed impossible during the darkest months following Elena's death. She understood that her role had been more than professional. She had served as a bridge between Victor's isolated grief and the possibility of renewed engagement with life's beauty and complexity. But perhaps the most profound change was in how Victor approached his business relationships and financial decisions. The near-criminal investigation that had initially threatened to destroy his reputation had ultimately forced him to examine whether his pursuit of profit aligned with the values Elena had embodied. His investment strategies now included careful consideration of their impact on communities and environments, not just their potential for generating maximum returns. His cryptocurrency portfolio, once focused purely on speculative gains, had been restructured to support blockchain applications in renewable energy, affordable housing development, and financial inclusion programs for underserved populations. When business associates questioned whether these constraints might limit his profit potential, Victor would reference Elena's belief that wealth without purpose was just elaborate poverty. A lesson he had learned through Rosa's example of finding meaning and service to others. The seasonal rhythms that governed Rosa's work in the mansion had acquired new significance as well. Spring cleaning now involved more than maintenance. It became an opportunity to refresh spaces where memories and hopes coexisted. Summer brought garden parties where Elena's friends celebrated her life while supporting causes she had championed. Autumn evenings found Victor and Rosa working together to prepare the house for visits from his children and grandchildren, their collaboration a living testament to how respect could flourish across boundaries of background and circumstance. Winter, once the season when grief felt heaviest and rooms too large for one person's sorrow, had become a time of reflection and planning for the year ahead. Victor would spend December evenings in his study not reviewing profit statements but crafting annual reports for the charitable foundation, documenting how Elena's legacy was creating opportunities for families whose struggles reminded him of the communities where Rosa had learned her values of perseverance and dignity. The FBI investigation that had once threatened to destroy Victor's reputation had ultimately vindicated his character while exposing corruption that had stolen millions from San Francisco's most vulnerable residents. Patricia and James's lengthy prison sentences sent a message throughout the city's political and development establishment that insider trading and charity fraud would be prosecuted regardless of the perpetrator's social connections or family wealth. But for Rosa and Victor, the investigation's most lasting impact was the confirmation that trust built slowly through daily interactions was stronger than suspicion manufactured through malicious accusations. Their relationship, tested by federal scrutiny and family betrayal, had emerged deeper and more authentic than either had initially thought possible. The story of their unlikely partnership had become legendary within circles that understood the complex dynamics between employers and domestic workers in San Francisco's most exclusive neighborhoods. Social justice organizations invited Rosa to speak about dignity in domestic work, while business journals profiled Victor as an example of how ethical leadership could emerge from personal crisis and community engagement. But Rosa preferred the quiet moments that revealed the depth of their mutual transformation. When Victor's youngest grandchild scraped her knee during a visit to the mansion, Rosa was the one who provided comfort and bandages, her gentle touch and soothing Spanish lullabies offering the kind of healing that wealth could not purchase. When Rosa's own mother faced a health crisis that required expensive treatment, Victor quietly ensured that insurance complications would not delay her care, understanding that financial security allowed families to focus on love rather than survival. These exchanges occurred without discussion or negotiation, expressions of care that transcended employment contracts or salary negotiations. They had discovered that genuine relationships could bridge differences in education, background, and economic circumstance when both parties approached each other with honesty about their needs and respect for each other's dignity. On quiet mornings when fog lifted early from San Francisco Bay, revealing the Golden Gate Bridge in the kind of perfect light that Elena had always hoped to capture in her watercolors, Rosa and Victor would sometimes find themselves working in companionable silence. She would arrange fresh flowers while he reviewed correspondence that balanced business concerns with charitable commitments. Their presence in the same space no longer carried the tension of employer-employee dynamics, but the comfort of two people who had learned to trust each other's character and intentions. The mansion's transformation from mausoleum to living home was complete, but the lessons learned during that journey continued to influence decisions large and small. When Victor considered new business investments, he would think about Rosa's stories of families struggling to afford San Francisco's inflated housing costs. When Rosa encountered other domestic workers facing discrimination or exploitation, she would remember how Victor's public defense of her integrity had protected her reputation and career opportunities. Their story had become a testament to the possibility of human connection across barriers that society often presents as insurmountable. In a city where wealth inequality created parallel worlds that rarely intersected meaningfully, they had discovered that respect, patience, and genuine care could bridge divides that seemed absolute from a distance. The annual memorial service for Elena had evolved from a private observance of loss into a celebration of her continuing influence through the charitable work that carried her name and values forward. Rosa would arrive early to arrange flowers throughout the mansion, creating displays that honored Elena's love of beauty, while welcoming friends and colleagues who gathered to share memories and commit to causes she had supported. Victor would speak at these gatherings not about his grief, but about the lessons Elena's death had taught him about life's fragility and precious nature. He would acknowledge Rosa's role in his healing, recognizing publicly that wisdom and strength could come from sources that social conventions often rendered invisible. His words would bring tears to audiences who understood that authentic relationships were among life's most valuable treasures, regardless of the circumstances that initially brought people together. The story of Rosa Martinez and Victor Hale had become a living example of grace emerging from grief, of dignity maintained despite pressure, of love expressed through daily acts of service and respect. They had proven that redemption was possible after profound mistakes, that character could be revealed through crisis, that wealth's true value lay in its capacity to serve purposes larger than individual comfort or social status. And have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without saying it out loud? Have you ever maintained dignity when others questioned your integrity, or offered compassion to someone whose grief had made them temporarily cruel? Have you ever discovered that your quiet strength was exactly what someone needed to find their way back to humanity? Tell me your story in the comments below. Share your experiences with employers who surprised you, or moments when your integrity was tested but remained unbroken. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of your own worth, leave a like and subscribe so it reaches another woman who needs hope today. For more emotional stories that honor the dignity of working women and the power of compassion to heal wounded hearts, click the link on the left to explore our full collection. Thank you for walking this journey with Rosa and Victor, for understanding that true wealth lies in relationships built on mutual respect, and that redemption is always possible when integrity leads the way. See you in our next story, where ordinary people discover extraordinary strength and love finds ways to bridge the deepest divides.